The Council Finance Committee meeting for September 12th. And is there anyone in the audience who'd like to speak to anything not on the agenda today? Seeing no one, we'll go straight to the agenda. And I think the first item is the annual investment policy overview. Is that right, Mr. Smario and Ms. Nemes?
Yes, that's correct. Chair Hart, committee members, I am Julie Nemes. I'm the Treasury Manager for the Finance Department, and I'll be starting today with the overview of the annual investment policy for fiscal year 2018. I will be going over a few different areas today. First, a little background on why we have an annual investment policy. Then I'll be talking about the scope and purpose of the investment policy. Why do we have an investment policy, as well as talking about what funds are included and the one-year delegation of authority that we include in the investment policy. Next, talking a little bit about the investment objectives for the city. After that, I'll be going over what the staff recommended changes are for fiscal year 2018, and included in that are one statutory recommended adjustment change, one administrative change, and then moving on to two recommended policy changes. And this comes from the August 15, 2017 Finance Committee meeting, where Finance Committee directed staff to include a change for social responsibility investing. And I'll be including two options for Finance Committee review and consideration today regarding socially responsible investing. And after that, I'll be talking about what the next steps are. So starting with a little bit of a background. So why do we have an investment policy? It is governed by state government law, state government code specifically 53600, which establishes what legally permitted investments are for government agencies. In accordance with state law, it establishes what procedures and guidelines we include in the investment policy to make sure there's prudent management of public agency funds. It also includes, we include in our investment policy what regulations are specified by state code in order to make sure our investment program is properly managed. I also wanted to state that state law actually does not require that we adopt an annual policy. However, for many years, staff has recommended that we do adopt an annual policy, and it is now included in our policy to adopt an annual one. We do this for many different reasons, but it's to make sure that we do incorporate any changes in state law every year, and also to incorporate any administrative changes, policy changes into an annual adoption. Also, just to make sure that we are being consistent with our investment objectives, which I'll be getting into a little bit later. Also, we want to make sure that we bring it back to City Council every year to make sure that City Council has an opportunity to review it and approve it annually prior to September 30th every year. I do want to point out there are a few instances where our investment policy is actually more restrictive than state code. One example of that is for certificates of deposit. We actually require a minimum rating of A for anything greater than $250,000, whereas state law does not require a minimum rating. So I wanted to move on to the scope of the policy. What does our policy cover? So first of all, we pool our funds, which basically means that we consolidate all of our cash balances for everything except for maybe some restricted funds. And we do that to maximize our investment earnings. And then we go and we allocate interest on a monthly basis to all of the funds. Most of the funds are included in the policy. That's going to be your general fund, your enterprise fund, your capital outlay fund, your internal service funds. But there are a few funds that are excluded. That would be your bond proceeds funds. We have one administrative change this year I'll be getting into a little bit later, but we, in fiscal year 17, did remove the service retirement fund. It closed. So we are recommending to remove that from a fund excluded from the policy, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. Moving on to what the purpose of the annual investment policy is. Why do we even need this? In the policy, it actually establishes criteria for who should be our financial dealers and institutions. On page 5, it actually sets out the specific requirements for who could be one of our financial dealers. And it's very specific, and it makes sure that we're working with people that know what they're doing, that are very good in their field. Also, it establishes the investing parameters. We want to make sure, for example, that we're diversifying. We're buying different types of investments with different maturities, and we're reducing our risk that way. Also, it sets maximum maturities, so we can't buy anything greater than 5 years unless council specifically authorizes it. It also sets an average maturity for the portfolio of 2.5 years, and currently our portfolio average is 1.8 years, which is about 650 days. Another purpose of our investment policy is to define what is a suitable and authorized investment. And this gets into very specific standards. There's about 5 pages between page 6 and 11 that gets into what are the state laws. It incorporates state laws, and what are the investment types, the minimum ratings, collateralization requirements. And it gets very specific about certificates of deposit, medium-term notes. And so it's very important that we are constantly looking at state law and making sure that we're following state law, and in certain situations a little bit more conservative than state law. It also defines standards of care. What we use is a prudent investor standard. Basically what that means is that anyone who manages the investment portfolio will act with care, skill, prudence, and diligence when managing the portfolio. Also, that we have no conflict of interest, that we will act in no way that will impair our judgment when managing the portfolio. Also, when we are defining our standard of care, we also set a 1-year period for delegating the authority to invest and reinvest funds. And in this section, it also establishes that management and oversight of the program will be delegated to the finance director, with the treasury manager authorized to conduct investment-related activities under the supervision of the finance director. But all purchases and sales do require dual signatures. I'm sorry? Mr. Samaro just mentioned that Mr. Casey is the city treasurer, and he is authorized as the city treasurer under our investment policy. And under the delegation of authority, he is authorized as the city treasurer. And it does state that on page 3 of our investment policy. Another purpose of our investment policy is to establish the reporting requirements to the governing body. As you know, we are required to provide monthly investment reports to City Council. And in this monthly investment report, it summarizes the portfolio at the end of the month, as well as any transactions that have occurred in the preceding month. On a quarterly basis, we also report to Finance Committee and City Council. We'll also include the statement at the end of the month, any transactions during the month, as well as a narrative on any noteworthy items, any economic conditions, interest rate environment. And then on an annual basis, we do what we're doing right now, the statement of investment policy to Finance Committee and City Council, where we make any recommended changes based on state law, any policy changes that might be technical or process related, or any administrative changes. Moving on to our investment objectives, I mentioned them earlier that we do have specific investment objectives that are included in our investment policy. We have 3 primary objectives. These should look pretty familiar. We talk about these at our quarterly reports. Our primary objective is safety. We are preserving the principal, we're preserving our portfolio. The preservation of principal is our primary responsibility, the safety. And so we do those through many different ways. I mentioned before, diversification is a very important way of preserving the principal. We do this through different maturities, investing in different types of securities, making sure that we invest in things that have minimum ratings. All of these are ways to ensure safety. Secondary to that is liquidity, making sure that we're meeting the operating needs of the city, that we have adequate liquidity. And secondary to safety and liquidity is yield. Are we earning a fair rate of return? So those are the 3 primary objectives of the city. I also wanted to state that the overall investment strategy is passive. We generally hold to maturity. That is the intent. We don't actively sell. So now that we have a little information on why we have an investment policy, the scope, the purpose, I wanted to get into what our recommended changes are for fiscal year 18. So we always look at what any changes that have happened in state law over the preceding 12 months, and there's actually only been 1 change in state law in 2017, and it is just a clarifying language change, so we are recommending that we include it in fiscal year 18. Senate Bill 974 was actually passed in the last 12 months. That is a clarification to Government Code Section 53601. It's related to what we call rating modifiers. And what this is the plus or minus sign that comes after a rating of A, B, or C on an investment. And what this states now is that we're going to clarify our language where in the past for sections, it's 7A5 medium-term notes and 7A7A commercial paper. In the past, we had it stated rated of A or better, or its equivalent or better, and now we'll say rated in a rating category of A or its equivalent or better. So it's just including those modifiers. The second change we're recommending is an administrative change. It's just an operating change. I mentioned it earlier that in fiscal year 17, we closed the City Service Retirement System Fund, and what that was a pre-PERS retirement fund for our safety members. We had 2 members left, so we did close it in fiscal year 17. We liquidated the assets and we distributed them to the 2 final beneficiaries. So now that the fund is closed, we are asking to, recommending that we remove that from the policy so it will no longer be a fund excluded from the investment policy. So moving on to what our 2 recommended policy changes are. As I mentioned on our Finance Committee meeting on 8/15/2017, Finance Committee did direct staff to make a change to the annual investment policy related to socially responsible investing. The recommendation was related to including a section on socially responsible investing to encourage investment in socially responsible companies, but not restricting purchase in companies that do not meet the criteria. Based on that direction, we have added a new section. It's Section 7C, Social Responsibility, and we have proposed an introductory paragraph on the following slide. I will read this paragraph to you. I just wanted to start out by saying that it refers to Section 3 in this paragraph, and I wanted to note that this refers to the 3 objectives I already noted earlier that are safety, liquidity, and yield. So I'll go ahead and read this to you because this is the introductory paragraph for the social responsibility. It's a little lengthy, so I apologize, but I think it's important to read. In addition to and subordinate to the objectives set forth in Section 3 herein, investment of funds should be guided by the following socially responsible investment goals when investing in corporate securities and depository institutions. Investments shall be made in compliance with the socially responsible goals to the extent that such investments achieve substantially equivalent safety, liquidity, and yield compared to investments permitted by state law. Prior to making investments, the city's director of finance will reasonably verify an entity's support of the socially responsible goals listed below through direct contact or through the use of a third-party resource. The entity will be evaluated at the time of purchase of the security. So I wanted to make one note about this before I move on to the next section of social responsibility, that we are currently working with our brokers to identify the best way to perform the research at the time of the purchase. So it's important we are doing the research at the time that we make the purchase. We're trying to do the research in the most efficient manner so as not to lose the opportunity to make the purchase. We have identified one tool, which is through Bloomberg. They offer what's called an environmental, social, and governance snapshot that one of our brokers is currently able to use, where he can put any company in, and it will give them this snapshot of all of their environmental, social, and governance ratings. And it's all data that's published from company disclosures. We're also able to do our own research based on news and other published information from the company. And we're going to continue to pursue other third-party resources, but this is what we feel is a good beginning step to be able to do the research at the time. And we're also going to continue to use the expertise of our brokers. So that will be the beginning paragraph that we're recommending. After that, we are proposing 2 different options for defining what the socially responsible goals will be. And this is also in accordance with Finance Committee direction on August 15th. Both of these options will encourage investment in socially responsible companies, but does not restrict investment that don't meet the criteria as we are directed. The option 2 differs from option 1 in that it also includes specific categories of companies in which investment would be discouraged. I did want to state that under both options, it's possible the city would make an investment that later is determined to be socially irresponsible. So option 1, this is the paragraph that identifies the socially responsible goals. Investments are encouraged in entities that support community well-being through safe, environmentally sound practices and fair labor practices. Investments are encouraged in entities that support equality of rights, regardless of race, sex, religion, age, national or ethnic origin, sexual orientation, or disability. Investments are encouraged in entities that promote economic development. Option 2 would include that first paragraph, but then we would also identify what types of investments are discouraged. And the paragraph is investments are discouraged in entities that manufacture tobacco products, weapons, military systems, nuclear power, fossil fuels, or entities that provide financing to fossil fuel companies. Investments are discouraged in entities that exhibit corrupt corporate ethics and governance. So those are the 2 options. So because we are including this social responsibility section, staff felt that we also needed another policy change related to social responsibility. As I mentioned, it's possible the city would make an investment that's later determined to be socially irresponsible. Since our investment policy is passive, we tend to hold, our goal is to hold to maturity. Our Section 9 performance standard states that we do have some situations that we will sell prior to maturity, and some of the situations would be where we are attempting to improve our yield or we have liquidity needs we had not planned for. And so we felt it was important to make a recommendation where we add another possibility to need to sell would be related to social responsibility. So we felt like we would add to Section 9C performance standards to allow securities to be sold prior to maturity when a security that subsequent to purchase fails to meet the city's social responsible goals. There was one other thing I wanted to just address is from the August 15th meeting. Finance Committee did direct staff to look into the University of California investment policy and their method of divesting. So staff did look into their investment policy. And in 2015, the University of California did divest of over $200 million of their about $98 billion fund of holdings in fossil fuels. And however, their investment managers stated it was due to sustainability issues and risk factors that they felt made those investments no longer worth keeping. They did state that they did not change their investment policy and they would continue to maintain over $10 billion in energy investments, including oil and natural gas. They also stated that they would not stop pursuing future fossil fuel investments and that if risks were reduced in the future, they would make more fossil fuel investments. In 2017, they also agreed to divest of over $475 million in Wells Fargo contracts. They stated this was due to the unauthorized bank and credit card accounts. I wanted to note that they did not make any change to their investment policy related to social responsibility. Currently, their section on social responsibility relates to tobacco products, and staff felt like it did not provide a template for social responsibility in the way that Finance Committee had directed staff to pursue one. So this moves us on to the next steps and what we're requesting from Finance Committee at this point. We are requesting direction on which of the 2 options to include related to social responsibility in the annual statement of investment policy. It is still subject to council approval. Based on which option is selected, we will then update the annual investment policy and take it back to full council for review and approval. And we're also asking for Finance Committee to recommend to council for council approval of all of the other staff recommended changes for the annual statement of investment policy. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Ms. Nemes? Councilmember Dominguez?
So on slide 17, the information you gave us on the UC system, they divested $200 million Out of 98 billion of holdings in fossil fuels, they maintain 10 billion in energy investments, including oil and natural gas. So is there a difference between fossil fuels and oil and natural gas?
I don't recall what the investment in fossil fuels that they divested, but they did make a point in their release that they maintained other oil and natural gas, and the ones that they released of fossil fuels was purely due to they felt they were risky and that they may lose money on them, but it wasn't because they were fossil fuels.
So were those like commodity holdings versus companies that would mine those commodities?
I don't recall.
Okay. The other question, so in the language you have up there, you mentioned corporate securities and depository institutions. Are those the two only categories that we invest in?
I'm sorry, which page are you on?
12.
And I'm sorry, what was your question?
So corporate securities and depository institutions, the last two objects in that first sentence. Does that include all of the possible investments we would make? Is that an inclusive statement?
Yes, I guess commercial paper, but we haven't bought commercial paper. I mean, that would be the only other area that it may be commercial paper. I guess we could include commercial paper in there.
But we do invest, community member Dominguez, we do invest in agency securities, treasury securities that aren't relevant to this discussion. So that is supposed to include those types of investments that where the social responsibility issues come up.
Yeah, we may want to.
Commercial paper.
Yeah, I was just so sorry. He's correct. I was just thinking anything else that that social responsibility issues could impact. We may want to include commercial paper in there. We have not bought commercial paper.
What is commercial paper?
It's just a shorter term. It's basically a short term, almost a short term CD. It's very short term banking investment. But we have not bought commercial paper as far as I know, in any time in the near future. But it is an allowable investment, so it may be worthwhile including commercial paper in this paragraph.
Most of the time, it's an overnight investment.
And that wouldn't fall under depository institutions?
I think it might, just for safety reasons, it'd probably be a good idea to include that as separate.
Yeah, because I don't think commercial paper will be subject to FDIC, for example, protections.
The other option would be just putting a period after investing and take out that last phrase. So should be guided by the following social responsible investment goals when investing, period. So that would include everything. And you mentioned like U.S. Treasury notes. I hope we don't get to the point where those are socially irresponsible.
That's a good point. True.
And then you talked about the primary objectives, safety, liquidity, and yield. So what's an example of an investment that's not liquid?
Degrees of liquidity.
I'll answer it this way. Every investment is liquid. We could sell any investment. It could be at a gain or a loss. For us, what we do is recognizing that we hold everything to maturity. We ladder our investments. So we have 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year paper. So we always have money coming in amounts that are adequate to cover all of our expenditure needs. So that's when we say liquidity. It's not that the security is either liquid or not liquid. It's that we are having maturities come in such a way that we always have enough money to pay the bills and not having to sell something between term.
So it's really a description of your balance between cash and investments more than it's really liquidity, because everything's liquid. Anything has a sales price.
Correct.
Which really brings in yield, because I guess in theory some of the investments would have a lower yield if you had to liquidate it.
Right. So, but the whole investment objective, you're dealing with idle cash. What do you do with idle cash? One thing is you invest it, and one thing is you maintain liquidity, and so which means you're not investing all of it, or you're ensuring that there's enough coming in so that you're able to pay your bills. So I think it's still relevant.
Right. And then if it's over liquid and it all comes to maturity at the same date, then you have to invest it at that point, and you may not get the same rate, which again gets back to yield. So I see them as very, very interconnected. Thank you.
Any other questions? We'll open it up for public comment then. And if you'd come up to the microphone and state your name and try and keep your comments to a couple minutes would be great. Anybody want to start?
I arrived late, so I don't know that I'm authorized. You probably have to fill out little forms.
No, just come on up and.
Hi, my name's Max Golding.
Just 1 second. Let's on.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Hi, my name's Max Golding. I highly recommend option 2 of the 2 options. I hope you guys choose option 2. Also, from some of the documents I was looking at before coming, there seemed to be other stuff that's not being discussed today, and that was concerning the maybe this is next week's meeting or something. It was the percentages. So there was like 15% SRI, and I think 85%. Everything that's not SRI. Was that
the next item on the agenda?
Okay, that's the
So
next
there's
item. Okay,
subsequent one.
okay, then maybe for
Banking,
after that.
vending.
So option 2. That's it. Please choose option 2. That's all.
Thank you. Anybody else want to speak to this item? Okay. We'll close the public hearing unless somebody wants to come and speak to the item. Please do. Just come up to the microphone, please. We need to get you on the tape.
Yes, my name is Nancy Capone, and I would also like to advocate for option 2, please. I'm part of the Standing Rock fossil fuel divestment movement, and I'm originally from Iowa, where they've been digging under our rivers, not just the Missouri River, of course, but the Mississippi River, and it's a grave danger, these new oil pipeline infrastructures that are being put in by these banks. And I think that our city has shown great leadership, and I thank you for your continued leadership on this issue.
Thank you very much. All right, with that, we'll close the public hearing and return the item to the committee. Any comments?
Could I ask another question?
Sure, go right ahead.
Regarding the language of option 2, so I notice it discourages investments in entities that manufacture tobacco products, weapons, military systems, nuclear power, fossil fuels. So the word manufacturer, that's supposed to apply to all these, so we're discouraging it if they're a manufacturer. So it wouldn't discourage investment in an entity that was a distributor.
That's correct, but we
Well-
could change that if you'd like.
Okay. And then the second part, it goes on to say, or entities that provide financing to fossil fuel companies. So the financing clause only applies to fossil fuels. So if someone's financing weapons, tobacco, or military systems, then they would be allowed under this.
Correct. We can modify that as well if you'd like.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that, but I'm curious.
But
was
that's
there
how
a-
it reads right now, correct.
Okay. And was there a reason to limit the financing clause to just fossil fuel companies, or?
Just based on prior meetings and comments from community members.
And how much would that impact our investment choices? Like, does just limiting to manufacturer, are there more distributors out there than manufacturers?
I honestly could not say.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious about what you, as our investor, how you would see this unfolding. Is that going to cause you to be doubling your time spent doing this kind of thing, or do you see yourself being able to stay as nimble and time efficient with 2 as with 1?
Option 2 will definitely take more time. However, right now we don't have as many corporates or CDs. We do generally, right now we are buying more agencies and treasuries. I feel with the assistance of our brokers, I'd be able to manage with option 2. It's doable.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other comments or questions? Is there a motion? Councilmember Dominguez?
I would move that staff take option 2 and present it to the full council with the language, either to exchange language that's more expansive than manufacturer and bring in the other categories to the second clause regarding financing, and allow the council to choose that if it wishes or not.
Second.
Is that clear to staff? All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed and abstain. The matter carries unanimously. Thank you very much. Brings us to the next item on the agenda, which is the banking services request for proposal, or socially responsible selection criteria for the banking services request for proposal.
Good afternoon again. I am now going to move on to giving Finance Committee a review of socially responsible selection criteria that staff is planning to include in the banking services request for proposal that we plan to distribute in about the next 1 to 2 months. I'm going to provide, again, just a little bit of a background on our banking relationships over the last 20 to 30 years. I won't spend a lot of time, I promise. Also, just a quick summary of the August 15th meeting and the direction that was provided to staff by Finance Committee. And then lastly, I'll go into the socially responsible selection criteria that will be going into the RFP, which includes the list of measures and then how we will be assigning the point values. So briefly, prior to 2012, the city did have a long-term banking relationship with Santa Barbara Bank and Trust. In that relationship, there were no hard dollar costs for banking services. Instead, it was a minimum daily balance that was required, which is called a compensating balance. When Santa Barbara Bank and Trust merged with Union Bank in 2012, Union Bank did honor that existing contract till February of 2014, where they waived the fees. Then they provided the city with a 10-month contract that had reduced what the bank called reduced fees, both for banking services and armored transportation. Then in January of 2015, the city entered into a 3-year contract with Union Bank that was at full fees for banking services, and then the city also had to enter into separate agreements for armored transportation. That contract will terminate in December of 2017, but there are annual extensions at the city's discretion. So in fiscal year 2017, staff decided it was best to issue a request for proposal for banking services, largely due to the significant increase in banking costs since the days of Santa Barbara Bank and Trust. Their costs for not only banking services, but as I mentioned, armored transportation. When we went to issue the RFP, we figured it was probably best to postpone it to obtain Finance Committee direction on including social responsibility criteria. Which brings us to the August 15th, 2017 Finance Committee meeting. At that meeting, staff did go over some of the issues with including social responsibility. We talked about how Santa Barbara does have very complicated services. There is a significant scope of services. We also went into how banking relationships change, information changes. Santa Barbara Bank and Trust became Union Bank, Wells Fargo. We learned information about them after making some investment decisions. We also talked about how it's a pretty significant process to change banks. It's 12 to 18 months. It takes a lot of staff time. A lot of departments are involved. We also went into what other municipalities are doing with their banking RFPs. Are they including social responsibilities? Some are, some are not. A common approach we're seeing is the Community Reinvestment Act rating. We're seeing a lot of cities, and what this rating is, are how much are banks giving back to their local community. And we're seeing that very frequently in RFPs. We're also seeing some cities look at past business practices, but we were not seeing any consider financing of fossil fuel companies. At the August 15th meeting, staff did provide 5 options for including social responsibility, all the way from excluding banks based on social responsibility criteria, such as providing financing to the Dakota Access Pipeline, all the way to not excluding anything on social responsibility. Finance Committee did direct staff to include socially responsible criteria using a point value system, which brings us to today. So we have looked at social responsibility selection criteria, and we've identified 4 measures that we plan to include in the RFP that we will then evaluate submissions based on. The first one is that financing is not provided to the Dakota Access Pipeline either directly or via a parent or subsidiary. The next is what level of local community involvement does the bank have and what level of reinvestment into the community. And this includes programs to assist local businesses, local home ownership, things such as that. We will also require their most recent Community Reinvestment Act rating, and that is they need to provide documentation of that rating, and they'll be one of 4 ratings. Also, we need to we require that they have no consent orders within the last 5 years of the date of the RFP for improper sales practices. And basically, what that means is that no consent orders from the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau or any other federal or state agency basically giving a legally binding order saying that they have had improper sales practices and they have to rectify those. Using those 4 measures, we would allocate 15% of the total points, which is 15 of 100 points. The remaining 85% or 85 points will be comprised of various other measures such as customer service, the bank's ability to provide other required services or additional services in the future, the security of the website, online platform, banking platform, other technology requirements, the total cost to the city, the financial strength of the banking institution, the completeness of the proposal. There's a whole range of other requirements we would evaluate the proposal on. And then we would use that criteria or all those criterias. We would include that in the RFP, evaluate the RFPs, and then hopefully issue that in the next 1 to 2 months, and then hope to implement that in about 12 to 18 months. So that would be our plan for the RFP with your approval. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions for Ms. Nemes? Councilmember White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This isn't on. I think this package is a good one to work from. The area of questioning I have is about the size of the bank. I know that this is an issue that limits the eligibility of banks to provide services to Santa Barbara City, and yet we have in our area a range of banks that are really coming along quite nicely. I think the largest of them would be Montecito Bank and Trust, and then they go down in size from there. But somewhere in there, it would be nice if Santa Barbara City was able to, as we did with Santa Barbara Bank and Trust for all those years, be using a local bank. Are we anywhere in the ballpark for that to occur? I know there's a capitalization was one of the issues that was of concern. Can you describe that a little bit?
I do think that there are some local banks that might be able to meet some of our needs. Montecito Bank is one that I think might be able to meet our needs. Regarding some of the much smaller ones, I think it'll be a little bit more difficult for them.
Yeah, I know there's going to be, they're all growing and in various stages of capitalization, but that's a direction in where we've been and where I would hope that we'd be able to go in the future. And can you describe, is Montecito Bank, for example, in the ballpark with capitalization, are you saying at this point? Or
Yes.
What are those numbers?
I think Montecito Bank and Trust actually is one that would definitely be in the ballpark of meeting our needs.
Right.
Yes.
And there might be a second one, we're not sure.
Great.
I think
Okay.
Montecito would certainly qualify.
And so that process then the Finance Committee would then initiate the process of saying we're going out for an RFP, and how is that working from here?
So today, if you approve the way that we are allocating the points with the social responsibility criteria, we'll go ahead and issue the RFP, and then we would receive proposals back, and the team that is made up of internal members within the city, largely IT, finance department, information technology, finance department, would evaluate those proposals, and then we would bring to the Finance Committee and City Council who we would recommend as the winner of the proposal.
Okay, and where we are now is that our contract is coming due, so that process is underway now or would get underway soon?
As soon as we receive authorization from you with today with the RFP, we will finalize the RFP and send that out and start receiving proposals in the next couple of months.
Good. Well, Mr. Chair, that sounds like a good opportunity then and I'd be encouraging this committee to be moving that forward to council.
Any other questions at this time? I guess I have a question. Why did you choose to have the point system and the 15% 85% for this element as opposed to a strict criteria that would not allow somebody to bid if they didn't meet this criteria?
So, based on the August 15th meeting and the 5 different options that we provided, we provided options all the way from excluding somebody from being able to bid if they provided financing or to the Dakota Access Pipeline or had unethical business practices, all the way to not including. And the one option that was selected on the 15th was to include criteria based on a point system. And then I went and I reviewed what other cities were doing with social responsibility and point ranges. And we saw from 4 points to 15 points was what I saw. And I selected the largest of other cities was 15 points, and that's why I selected 15.
Okay. Thank you.
But it was,
Mr.
based, it
Smart?
was based on direction from the committee
Okay.
to use that approach.
Perfect. Then we're going to open this up to public comment now. So anybody that'd like to speak to the committee, please come on up to the microphone and state your name and try and limit your time to a couple minutes, please.
Hello. I'm really pleased that you went with option 2. I think it's great. I would like to. I just have a question or a comment about the allocation of the points and the point system. It would seem to me what would make more sense is that, and I'm speaking from the background, I'm a bookkeeper. I deal with finances, and I've had to make these kinds of selections. The first criteria, which is a 100% criteria, is it has to meet the bottom line criteria of being usable by the city. So it has to be capitalized sufficiently. We can't take a risk of it not being capitalized enough. We know that. It has to have technology that is within usable limits of what we can tolerate. We don't have that many banks to choose from here. So my feeling is we take those banks that are acceptable, and then we apply the social criteria, and we have a point system within the social criteria. So rather than 85% being this and 15% being that, I would say we eliminate everything that's not acceptable, rather than just say it's 85% points, and say after that, the rest of the criteria that we will use, and specify that and allocate it that way. Does that make sense? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying?
I think it does, but I don't know if it gets to the cost element, which is another criteria that's going to be scored.
But that's what I was saying. Come up with the bottom line of, well, we can't go below this. Eliminate everybody else. And then we say, for example, 50% of the consideration is cost and 50% is social. Or perhaps, there's a range in the cost. The percentage allocation doesn't really clearly address. It makes it look like, well, if it's going to cost $10 more a month, we won't consider. Well, then that's as much of a factor as if they invested in the pipeline. So I would play with it a little bit.
Understand your point. Mr. Smart, did you want to comment, or do you want to save it?
You want me to? I can.
Well, why don't you save it until, because I think we may have other people with other different ideas, and maybe we just coalesce them at the conclusion. Mr. Golding?
Yeah, so I'm really curious. It's a similar concern. So I appreciate hearing, Julie, that you were actually 15% seemed like it was actually the highest of everything you looked at. There were some concerns by a couple members in the Standing Rock Coalition looking at this and saying, well, this potentially could kind of backfire, I guess. Like we thought it looked low initially by seeing that, let's say you have the 85% criteria met, which, I mean, I could imagine being relatively easy with most banks to find, maybe not. But then let's say that there's So I'm trying to find the words to articulate this. Let's say there's a bank, even a local bank. Let's say there's like Montecito Bank and Trust, and they have some investment themselves in a larger bank, or some financial affiliation or something like that, in that's invested in DAPL. How does a 15% look at that? I mean, would that be right, like 1 point or 2 points, or that's where it's a little bit confusing, where I feel like there's room where investments in the stuff that the whole point was to get those investments out, that they could still come into the investment pool on accident with a point system that allows for 15% instead of higher. But I don't know exactly what the alternative would be, other than I think what Michael is saying is just to get rid of a point system and just list the stuff that you won't allow into the investment pool. So I'm curious what can come from that. So thanks.
Anybody else want to comment on this item? Okay. Well, looks like we do. Ms. Gore?
Oh, hi. I'm Sarah. I just wanted to respond a little bit to the notion of what the UC system has done. I realize that was in the last section, but I think it pertains to this section also. I was just trying to do a little research, and I think maybe it hasn't made it into their policy the way that you were describing, where the numbers may not show it in terms of their investments, but they have taken some steps. They joined this UN-supported Principles of Responsible Investing, which the Secretary General started in 2005, and they joined a carbon pledge. So in terms of what they've done, this is what I've quickly been able to look at. And part of the carbon pledge is that it's part of what the UN is recommending through their Principles of Responsible Investing, and it includes measuring the carbon footprint of one's investments. So based on my understanding, it seems like they're taking steps to develop a socially responsible investing policy. So that's something to look at and maybe consider. The carbon pledge is one that the UN started. So I just wanted to add that, and I appreciate that that there may not be an exact model to copy really easily, but I'm hoping that if we put our heads together, we can come up with ideas that works for Santa Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Yes, please, come on up.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I'm really happy with the direction everything's going, and I'm really grateful for the time that you've taken to consider all these different options. Just to kind of reflect on what Max Golding was saying, the question here is regarding the 15% of the SRI aspect of this, what percentage of that is investment in the Dakota Access Pipeline? That is still kind of an unknown factor, so there might be a way that a bank could satisfy other aspects of the SRI but still be investing in Dakota Access Pipeline, and which would nullify the impact of that. Personally, we've talked about it, and we would, of course, love to see something more along the SRI being 33% and having the DAPL aspect itself be 15%, so that aspect does carry considerable weight in the consideration of prospective banks for our city. Okay.
Thank you. I think we're going to have some comments from staff to that. Well, with that, I'll close the public comment and return it to the committee. Mr. Samario, would you like to answer some of the questions folks have raised?
I'll just make a few comments, and if Ms. Nemes wanted to add to that, that's great. So the 85%, I think there's confusion. It's not an all or nothing thing. It's really relative. So all the proposals will be competing within that 85% on what kind of service they provide, what kind of technology they have, and it's again relative. So some may get 85% or 85 points. Some will get something. Most will get below that, and we're looking for who gets the most points overall based on all those criteria we're looking for. It's not like they're in or out. They're all going to be in as long as they meet certain minimum criteria. Some will not propose because they look at the proposal requirements. RFP requirements, they say, well, we can't deliver. We can't provide lockbox, for example, so they're not even going to submit. But those who submit, which will be a handful, will be basically rated relative to one another. And they'll, within that 85 points, they're going to be in that scale. So that's how we're going to use that. So it's not in or out. Just to kind of respond to one of the comments. Then the 15 points will be, in a lot of cases, it'll be they get either 15 or they get 0. There'll be some gradation in there. But if somebody, for example, has invested in the Dakota Pipeline, then they're going to get 0 points for that. So it's sort of that one is sort of all or nothing. There's less gradation there, but the rest of it is going to be more sort of linear and gradual. I hope that helps in terms of how we're going to approach this. And if Ms. Demas wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, there's 4 measures. So there's a couple measures in there, like Mr. Samario said, that, if they invest in Dakota Access Pipeline, it's an immediate 0. If they have a consent order, it's an immediate 0. If there's 4 Community Reinvestment Act ratings. If they have the second highest, they're going to lose some points. If they show that they have some local community involvement, but not what we feel is sufficient, they're going to lose some points. So there is some variation in there, but there are certain ones in there that they will immediately lose all 15 points. So I hope that helps clarify.
Councilmember White, you had a question?
I'm just ready for comment on this.
Okay, that's fine too.
And that is that this is one of those fluid areas where, as the years go by, we're going to just be seeing this area getting more attention and more transparency, and that's so that whatever policies we set today are next year there's going to be different information available. We're hearing that and different options and perhaps different criteria of social responsibility too. So this is, I think we make an imperfect decision today and move forward. I'm excited to hear that, for example, that Montecito Bank is sufficiently capitalized to be eligible to be competing for our business. At least that's one. So, and that the transparency is the other it's one of the other areas where no matter what decisions are made, that folks are going to be able to see what the city is doing. And be able to then respond in various places, including the ballot box. So I think those are good criteria. I like where this is going, and I'm satisfied that this is, again, is it perfect? No, but it's going to be good enough, I think.
Any other questions or comments? The only thing I'd add too is that this is a tool to evaluate the folks that are proposing, and that ultimately the council is going to make the decision about which bank we'd recommend to use. So there are other opportunities for folks to comment through this process in front of the Finance Committee first, and then ultimately in front of the council too. So we'll see how this tool works in practical application with the folks that propose, and we'll have an opportunity to look at that more carefully in the future.
And the only clarification, we'll be bringing to you a recommendation, of course, based on that rating. It'll be fairly objective, some subjectivity, but we're going to say who has the highest points overall, and that's who we'd recommend, theoretically.
All right, well, is there a motion from the committee? Councilmember Dominguez?
I was going to ask one more question. What's the timeline? When do you think you'd be back to us after the RFP process?
My guess is about 4 to 6 months.
Okay. And do you need to do it this year? Or do we just roll over into next year with Union Bank?
That's correct. We have 1-year extensions at the city's discretion, but we also have a 60-day clause that we can terminate at any time.
Okay. And then regarding a motion, do you need a motion from us, or what are you looking for? You're ready to go at this point, right?
No, this was just a report to bring for your review, unless you'd like us to make any changes.
Okay. Nope. All right. Well, considering there's no changes proposed or suggested, I think the matter's finished, and we will adjourn the meeting now. Thank you.